Hello, and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again, as always, on the program today. And I just want to give you all a quick reminder that we are a listener-supported organization. So we would appreciate it if you would help us out with the things that we do. Go to justsinner.org, go to our donate page there, and you can help us out. You can give a one-time gift. You can give every month. You can give quarterly. There are all different ways to do that. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which means that any gifts you give are tax deductible. We are going to be continuing our series on Christology as we are looking through Rev. Franklin Widener's book on Christology as a kind of introductory course, and it's not really that introductory, I guess. But it's meant to be even kind of a seminary level course, really, on Christology in some ways. So we began discussing two talks ago, we started talking first about the humiliation of Christ in Scripture, and then we began a discussion of some of the history surrounding the humiliation of Christ. And so we looked at Christ's humiliation in the Church Fathers. Well, we examined especially some of the earlier Church Fathers, so we looked at Tertullian and Origen. I guess the two of them aren't always considered church fathers, since the two of them kind of moved into some weird views, but you get the point. So some early Christian writers that are really significant on these various points. And then we talked a little bit about what happened at the Reformation. We revisited a little bit the Luther-Zwingli debate and how that relates to the doctrine of the humiliation of Christ. With this, we're keeping in mind the kenotic controversy throughout. So we're thinking through the humiliation in response to the way that a lot of 19th century theologians begin to speak about the humiliation of Christ as an actual giving up of the divinity in some way at the moment of incarnation, giving up attributes of the divinity. Different ways to parse this out. And the separate talk on kenoticism parses out who some of those thinkers are and what their views are. But we've been looking at the earlier church with a view to trying to understand how those newer debates and newer ideas, they were newer at the time, but they're still relevant today, fit into kind of the broader scope of the entire history of the church regarding the doctrine of the humiliation of Christ. So let's then look. We've done the Reformation. We looked at the teachings of Martin Luther. And then we get to a division that shows up among Lutheran theologians. So we have, there are two different places two different times where there are debates among Lutheran theologians regarding the incarnation. So we have this Brenz and Chemnitz debate here, and then we also have the Tübingen and Giessen theologians who disagree on this point as well. So we're going to be looking at some kind of inter-Lutheran debates. Eventually the kenotic issue becomes a inter-Lutheran debate, but extends far beyond Lutheran churches. It begins within a Lutheran context, but then it certainly is not limited to a Lutheran context even today. It becomes far broader than that. But so let's start to look at these two figures. Now, two really kind of giants of theological thought in the 16th century. We're talking two second-generation reformers, and those are John Brenz, or Johannes Brenz, as often it's said, because it's German after all, and then Martin Chemnitz. So Martin Chemnitz is probably the better known name among many people, but Brenz was a very important, well-respected theologian at the end of the 16th century as well. Okay, so page 91 in Widener's Christology, if you are following along in this volume. The Christological views of John Brenz are contained in the 8th volume of his works, published at Tübingen in 1590. So 1590 is the release of Brenz's works. So we're talking 10 years after the Book of Concord here. So these are written earlier. So this is very, very early. These views show up prior to the writing of the actual Formula of Concord. So this is Brenz's perspective here. He says, the two natures in Christ, for Brenz, are not merely united in one person, but into one person. Okay, so this is going to be different from the classical view that you find in somebody like John of Damascus. So their union, or the union of natures, constitutes the person, and involving by the very fact of the union a communication of their respective properties. The Reformed idea, as consisting in a mere sustentation of the humanity, so that's a sustentation. I guess that means sustaining, but it's an odd word. So sustentation of the humanity by the Logos was repudiated by Brenz as not a personal union at all, but merely a communion such as God may form with any man. So and this is a concern that ends up showing up a little bit later when the doctrine of the mystical union is formulated, is that theologians are concerned to say that there is a distinction between the way that God is united to us and the way that God is united in the person of Christ. I mean, obviously this matters because what we don't want to do is make Christ just a kind of prototype of what happens to us, so that when I say I am united with God, and Scripture uses that language very clearly, does that mean, well, that my personhood, because my personhood is united to the divine essence, as is the case in mystical union, and we can even talk in the mystical union about an interpenetration of essences, as the Lutheran Orthodox later do. Well, how does that differ from Christ's union, the union of the humanity of Christ with the divine nature? So Brenz is very concerned to say that there has to be something unique about the union of the Logos with the humanity of Christ that differentiates that from the general union that believers have, because the union that we have with God is very real and intimate. Scripture uses the language that we partake of the divine nature. So somehow we have to differentiate my, say, partaking of the divine nature from the way in which the humanity of Christ partakes of the divine nature. So that's the issue that Brenz is trying to get at here, and he's trying to guard against a view that he's really trying to guard against the Reformed, as Widener says here. And there is this constant fear that there is an encroaching Nestorianism in the Reformed notion of the two natures because of a lack of real communication between the natures. So there's this fear that you essentially have this divine person of the Logos who just is kind of united to a human nature in some way. Well, if that's true, then how is that any different from the fact that I am a human and the divine Logos is united with me? I mean, that's Brenz's concern. So remember that in the view of John of Damascus, which really becomes, I mean, that's the view that pretty much is the Orthodox view, generally accepted pretty much all over the map, is the idea that there is an impersonality of the humanity of Christ. So that the personhood of the Son is the personhood of the Logos. So that there is a communication of personhood. So that there is no it's not that there's a divine person and a human person, and the two come together. That's Nestorianism. So that there is no personhood of the humanity at all. There is just the personhood of the Logos that is communicated to humanity. Now, Brenz, he's not coming to a Nestorian perspective, because he's not saying there are two personalities, but he's saying the one personality, the one personhood, is in the actual sharing of natures. So he wants to have a shared personhood in a way that for Brenz is going to then guard against the encroaching Nestorian error of the Reformed. That's kind of what he's fearing when he constructs this idea. Okay, so we'll keep reading here on page 92. So according to Brenz, the human nature was made capable of all divine properties without any exception. So he's here going a little bit beyond, I think, where Luther goes on this point. We're just not talking about a communication of certain properties. And I mentioned this before, that we do have a communication of certain properties, but not all properties. For example, the human nature is not simple, because human nature by definition is a composite thing, so it can't be simple. I did mention before immateriality as something that was not communicated. I did have a comment from somebody saying, well, isn't that true, though? Because in the illocal sense, Christ's human body is immaterial. So yes, but not in an absolute sense. In other words, there still is a material physical body that Jesus has. So his body doesn't become completely immaterial. So there is still, it's not an absolute immateriality like you have with the divine nature. And so you see that in some ways, that you see that some things are true of the divine nature that are communicated to the humanity. They're true in some sense, but not in an absolute sense. So you may say something like, the humanity of Christ, is it immutable? Okay, so is it unchangeable? That's an attribute of the divine nature. And we might say, well, in some sense, immutability is given to the human nature in ways like, well, Jesus is not going to change his essential character or his faithfulness or certain things about him are not going to change. However, he's not immutable in the sense that he actually has a body that, moves and changes its locale in ways that the divine nature does not. So we may say it's true in some sense, but not in an absolute sense. So Brenz goes pretty far beyond this by saying that there is no exception to these divine capabilities. The humanity of Christ is capable of absolutely anything regarding the divine nature. And he says, if it had not such a capacity to partake in all of the attributes of divinity, there would be no difference between him and other men. So again, this is his concern, is to say that we don't want to conflate the mystical union with the hypostatic union. There's something unique about Jesus, and he's trying to work this out, and this is the way that he does it. Nor could the Word have become incarnate. Brenz is very careful to explain that in the person of Christ, neither nature is changed into the other, but both remain inviolate and in possession of their essential properties. So he's still trying to retain the distinction of natures, but Brenz does, and I wouldn't say that Brenz, is a monophysite. Brenz is not saying that there is only one nature, but that's the danger. And this is always the case in Christology, is that there is always the danger of jumping into either Nestorianism on one hand or Eutychianism on the other. Nestorianism being this idea that there are two persons, and Eutychianism being this idea that there is only one nature. So it's always the danger to separate the natures or to conflate the natures. And Orthodox Christology has always tried to maintain the integrity of the two natures and the unity of the person. And this is really the difficulty that the Reformed and Lutherans are trying to hash out at this time. And these are things that the Church has been concerned about, forever. So for the Reformed, there is constantly the fear of Eutychianism that I think leads the Reformed in a more Nestorian direction. I'm not saying they're absolute Nestorians. But then the danger on the Lutheran side is that people tend toward going in a direction that could lean toward monophysitism, as you see in Brenz's position. Now, he's not a monophysite. He's not a Eutychian. But it is the case that he's kind of moving far in that direction. And I think this is, there's a warning in this for all of us that we need to be careful that our theology is not made in reaction to other people. We need to make sure that our theology is not just pure reaction to an error, because this is what you find in all sorts of errors of theology. So look at the second generation reformers. Brenz's idea is really driven largely by this fear of the Reformed Nestorian approach. So he tries to formulate something that's going to answer that, and he does that instead of, I think, starting from a more positive ground of what can we say. Not how can we not be the Reformed? What is a positive construal of theology? Not that he hasn't come up with a positive construal, but I think it's that critique that leads him toward that positive construal. So another example of this would be Matthias Flacius. And this is what's called the Flacian error, where Matthias Flacius, even though he was a very bold Lutheran theologian, very important for the Reformation, Flacius ended up responding to synergism with such hostility that he formulated this idea that the human essence is sin itself, which is essentially Manichaean and is rejected in the form of Concord, and thankfully rejected. I mean, it's a huge problem. and I do fear that there are some Lutherans today that still speak in Flacian language, but that's absolutely rejected in our confessions. But you see, what he was reacting against was this kind of neo-Pelagianism or semi-Pelagianism, which was correct. He was right to react, to respond, but then he formulated his answer as a response in reaction rather than a positive construal. So that's always an error in theology that we have to be aware of. And I think we see this in Brenz. And on the Calvinist side, I would say very much Beza is this. So Calvin is far, and I have plenty of critiques of Calvin, but Calvin is far more balanced than Beza. And especially in Beza's debate with Andre, his response to Lutherans, Beza goes in really extreme directions. And you see this, he's a supralapsarian, for example, which is a very strict form of double predestinarian Calvinism. And Beza is very much a reactionary thinker, that he responds kind of in the extreme, formulating views in opposition to those he opposes. So we see this here in Brenz. All right, so he says, the humanity, for Brenz, is indeed declared to be omnipotent, omnipresent, and omniscient, but it is not declared to be omnipotence itself. So here's where he is putting the safeguards there to say that we can say that all of the divine attributes are true of the humanity. In some sense, they're true kind of necessarily because of the incarnation for Brenz, but rather than freely or as gift, which is what Chemnitz is going to emphasize. And I think that's a very important distinction. But he says, of God alone is this affirmed. The humanity possesses only a communicated divinity and is made equal to God not in being, or ousia, but in authority, exousia. So he's equal to God in authority, but not in being. And he's trying to make these distinctions to guard against monophysitism. So he doesn't quite get to the Eutychian position, but he's still kind of leaning in that direction in some ways, but trying to put the kind of rails, the safeguards around it, so he doesn't quite fall off on that side. All right, so there we have then some clear distinctions. He's trying to say all of the divine attributes are true of the humanity. However, they're not true of the humanity just as the humanity by itself, but because of the communication from the divinity. So he's not saying they become essential attributes of the human nature, and that's going to be a clear distinction. Because if they become essential attributes of the human nature essentially becomes divinity. And then we have, I think, and I do wonder what Brenz does with simplicity, or is simplicity not really, maybe simplicity isn't quite an attribute in and of itself. Maybe simplicity is a way of framing the attributes as they relate to the divine essence, which, simplicity kind of is that. But how does he deal with simplicity in relation to the human nature? Because I think that would lead to some serious issues, and I think there are major questions that we have to answer in that regard if you're going to take a view like Brenz. Okay, so then he goes on to talk about Brenz. As Luther had done before him, he distinguishes between four kinds of presence. So here are the four kinds of presence. We've talked about this before. I had a program on the presence related to the nature of the Lord's Supper. So these modes of presence first show up in Luther. It's very standard within Lutheran history. So Brenz isn't doing anything particularly original here. Andre uses them in his debate with Beza, and Chemnitz uses them. Everybody uses them. So here are those distinctions. We have a local or circumscriptive presence. That is, a local presence is, and I know that sounds weird to people because when you say a local presence, it's like, well, every presence is local. That's kind of the point of a presence. But what they mean in scholastic terminology here, this distinction comes from, it's either Scotus or Occam, and I can't recall which first uses this. But a local presence is one where, like, something is present and I can actually touch it. Right? I got my Dunkin' Donuts coffee cup here, and it's locally present because I can touch it. I can taste the coffee that's in it. I can feel it. I can smell it. And yeah, I drink Dunkin' Donuts coffee. No, I know it's not amazing coffee, but it's everyone from Mass drinks Dunkin' Donuts. You just have to. So that's a local presence. It's something you can kind of touch, taste, see. You can experience it with your senses. There is an illocal presence, and the illocal presence is one that is more of a mysterious presence. So this is why we can say that Christ is present in the Lord's Supper. It's not a local presence, which by local presence we don't mean it's not really present here, because that's not how the terminology is being used here. What we mean is it's not a presence that is a kind of ordinary presence. So you can't if you partake of the Eucharist, it tastes like bread. Okay, you don't smell, touch, taste something that's different from ordinary bread. However, it still is the body of Christ, but it is that in a mysterious supernatural way, a hyper-physical way, as some of the later Lutheran Orthodox are going to say. Okay, then we have the definitive presence and the repletive presence. Now, we'll talk about definitive as we move on because he's got a little bit of an explanation of that. Repletive is the general notion of God's presence in terms of divine omnipresence, which is to say that when you encounter God, he's present in such a way that you encounter the whole of him, not just a part of him. So he's not just ubiquitous in the sense that he is stretched out. He doesn't have an essence that is stretched out, so I encounter part of God here, another part of God, in my kitchen. We understand God is present everywhere, but he is, wherever he is present, he is fully present. So it's totally different kind of presence than we have for normal physical testable objects. So God's presence differs radically from any human presence or material presence that we have in ordinary circumstances. All right, so then we'll read some of what Widener says about these four modes of presence in Brenz here. He says all four of these modes of presence are possible for the body of Christ. The first he had when he was on earth. That's the local presence. Okay, so that's the apostles could touch him, talk to him, hear him with their ears. So he had a local existence here and there in space. So it's a presence of an extended body. It's extended in space. It actually takes up space. The second, or illocal presence, is attributed to the Logos, to which the humanity was united. So we're talking here about then the omnipresence of the human nature of Christ. When we say that Christ is present everywhere as God and man, we're not saying that he's present in the sense that I could take a sample of the air and find human DNA there that is that of Jesus' human body. Here's a quote from Brenz here. After the Son of God united himself to humanity, it necessarily follows that humanity, assumed into the unity of the one person by the Son of God, is everywhere by a personal omnipresence. So the key word there that we're going to see is the way that he formulates this is by necessity. So for Brenz, there was a necessity in the fact that the Logos is united with the human nature means that the human nature now has to be omnipresent. It's of the essence of the union itself. Not that God freely chooses to exercise via his will that kind of omnipresence through the humanity of Christ. So there's going to be the big difference with Brenz here. Okay, then we have the definitive presence, which I didn't give an explanation for here. So I'm going to read his definition because I think it's helpful here. He says definitive presence, and this is the one this one doesn't actually show up in as much as the others do in discussion. I think the kind of local, illocal tends to show up the most just because it's relevant to debates about the Lord's Supper. But the definitive presence is this: when a thing is in a particular place but cannot be measured by the space of the place. Christ's body had when it rose out of the grave through the stone at the mouth of the sepulchre, and when afterwards he passed through closed doors. So this is the example that people often use for this. Well, I guess there are two examples that people use for this. So a definitive presence would be something like the angels. Okay, so the angels, we can say that they're in a place, but the angels don't have mass. So we're not saying the angels are not omnipresent, so we don't have this repletive presence. They're not present everywhere as God is, but they also don't have a kind of measured physical presence. But the second example is the soul, right? And this is what people use this example all the time. This is probably the most common one, but we recognize the soul is in the body, but the soul does not take up space in the way that the physical body does. And we all kind of recognize that the soul animates the body, but is not, the soul is not made of parts. And yeah, you could say in some, yes, the soul has, if you're talking about act and potency, yes, but it doesn't have parts in the same way that like a body would have parts. So it's kind of got a relative simplicity. In other words, I don't have part of my soul somewhere. Okay, so I can't my soul is a unified thing. I can't take part of my soul and say part of my soul is in my hand, part of it's in my head. Half of my soul is in this half of my brain, and the other half is in the other half of the brain, or something. No, we're talking about something that is whole and unified. So it has a presence in a particular place, but that's different from a kind of physical presence that actually takes up physical space. So then we have the fourth, the repletive presence, which belongs to God alone, who fills all places and is measured and contained by no place, which Christ had and has in virtue of personal union with the omnipresence of God. Okay, so we already kind of defined that before, so I don't think I need to go more into that. He invests the humanity of Christ this is Brenz does. Brenz invests the humanity of Christ with all divine qualities, even with divine majesty from the moment of incarnation. So the genus majestaticum here is kind of received in its fullness at the incarnation because it has to be there, right? So it's not that the majesty operates or is given through the human nature by choice. This is just of the essence of the union itself, because the person is the union of the two natures for Brenz. And here is where I think you have a major problem with divine immutability, because now the incarnation, like classically, of course, the question of the incarnation, as I mentioned before, raises issues of immutability, because it seems like a change in God, because God didn't have a human nature, now God does. Now, the classical way to understand this or explain how this fits with divine immutability is to say that the change is not in the divine nature, but the change is in the human nature. So the human nature is assumed into God, so that it's not that the divine nature itself changes. Well, for Brenz's view, the divine nature does change, because we do have a uniting of personhood. And personhood, the personhood of the Logos is no longer the personhood of just the divinity, but the personhood of humanity and divinity. So you see that there's really no way to escape the kind of challenge to immutability that you have from Brenz's position. Okay, so let's see. He says, at the incarnation, at the moment when the hypostatic or personal union of the natures took place, there was an invisible ascension of the God-man. So this is strange. There is an invisible ascension of the God-man according to his human nature at the right hand of God, and this differs mainly from the historical ascension of the Mount of Olives, in that this latter ascension was visible, and that while in his earthly state he lived in a state of humiliation, now in an exalted state, he has entered upon the full use of majesty and glory, even according to his human nature, of that which he always had. So, so here you have this, in Brenz's perspective, there is an exaltation of the humanity in its fullest sense at the incarnation, because there has to be, and therefore that means there is a kind of ascension before the ascension, so that now the humanity of Christ is exalted to the right hand of the Father. And the ascension that we have later in the life of Jesus is simply just a visible change, but not an actual change in any way regarding the humanity. This is such a hard idea to reconcile with the various places in Scripture where the humanity receives things in time. I mean, extensively, and we've talked about this, that there are so many texts that talk about the authority that Jesus receives in time, or the ascension, there's a change in time, or the one who descended is now the one who ascended, who now fills all things. There's a difference somehow in the humanity of Jesus before and after the ascension. And what Brenz does is essentially say all of those texts are just about not an actual change to the humanity or anything actually communicated that wasn't already there, but it's just a visible change. It's just a change on how we see him. It's just not what the texts say. And there's nothing that indicates that kind of thing in the text. So you have a really hard time, I think, exegeting those texts from Brenz's perspective. But let's see what else he says here. He expressly says that Christ concealed his majesty in a state of humiliation, meaning that it was there in all of its fullness, but only concealed from view by the form of a servant which he had assumed, because the work of salvation made such assumption necessary. Christ did not always or perfectly conceal his majesty, however, although he did not in the time of his humility exhibit the supreme majesty which he had. So the humanity has the supreme majesty, it's just veiled from view. Whereas we'll see in Chemnitz's view, he receives he has the fullness of majesty according to his divine nature. In the union, that can be exercised through the humanity at any time, but it is not always exercised. So, but Brenz is saying it's more than just exercising it, it's more that it's just veiled from view, even though it's already there according to the humanity. So sometimes the majesty of the humanity does appear, such as the 40 days fast, the walking on water, the assumption of his invisibility, transfiguration, and miracles in general. Okay, and then here we have Widener defining what is the uniqueness of Brenz's position in short here. And here's the summary, and then we move on to the view of Chemnitz. He says, we might state the particular teaching maintained by Brenz was that Christ, even in the state of humiliation, was not only in possession of divine glory, but exercised it even here, just not openly. So he exercised the divine glory. He had all the divine glory, he just didn't openly exercise it. Which makes it very, very strange to reconcile the notions of Christ growing in knowledge in the fullest sense. If he really has divine omnipotence, he's just not showing it. Does it just appear as if he's growing in knowledge, but he's not actually? So he says, here's a quote from Brenz: "While in humiliation, he was lying dead in the grave. While he was alive, he was governing heaven and earth in majesty, and indeed during the time of humiliation before the resurrection." All right. So, yeah, you just get here's a good summary of where he's coming from. So there's Brenz's view. And this is, I think, an overcorrection, as I said, from the Reformed. But what's helpful about Brenz in looking at this controversy is that it shows the boundaries around which we are talking about the two natures. So it shows what we are not saying, because what Brenz says, sometimes I've encountered in conversations with the Reformed over Christology, that it's almost the assumption that Brenz's view, and they don't probably know to identify it with Brenz, but it's the assumption that that's the Lutheran view, that there is some kind of necessary through the incarnation. It's necessary now, rather than freely given, that the humanity of Christ has these divine attributes. And the concern with that is, again, that it leads toward Eutychianism. Okay. So then let's look at Martin Chemnitz, the work of Martin Chemnitz. So then he moves on to Chemnitz. Martin Chemnitz is his great work on the two natures of Christ, first published in 1570. You can get that from CPH. It's a really wonderful volume. If I wanted to do a really in-depth study on Christology, I could go through Chemnitz's book, which is more intense than this one, and it's very long, but very much worthwhile. It's a hefty book. So Chemnitz, in that book, maintained that the whole fullness of the deity of the Son of God, from the first moment of the hypostatic union, dwelt bodily in the assumed nature of Christ, so that it shines forth and puts forth its energy in and through the assumed nature. So that at the very moment of the hypostatic union, the Logos is present in the flesh, and the personality of the Logos is the personality of the Son in the human nature as well. So it's not these two separate natures creating a new personality. It is the personality of the Logos. So then he says, Chemnitz's view, this is against the kenoticists here, and clearly neither Brenz nor Chemnitz is following where the kenoticists go. So for Chemnitz, the humiliation was a hiding, not a laying aside of the divine majesty, glory, and power. So that the humiliation is not a getting rid of these divine attributes, as the kenoticists are going to say, but he's also not just going to say it's just a veiling from other people or from visibility, but that he is not exercising these attributes through the humanity, even though they are the property of the Son, who is in his personhood, the Logos. Okay, and then the exaltation is a return to the full plenary and manifest possession, use, and manifestation of the divine majesty at the right hand of God. The divinity resuming, and the humanity perfectly assuming. So there is assuming that glory. So there is actually a moment in which the humanity assumes that glory that is at the ascension. It's not just all present here in this kind of invisible ascension that Scripture never mentions. All right, so then we move on. In Chemnitz here, he says, Chemnitz thus taught a partial renunciation of the use of Christ's majesty. So it's partial. He's not never drawing on the majesty, because we clearly see that in his miracles and other things. So here's a quote. The human nature, in the first moment of the union, received and possessed the majesty and fullness of the deity, but during the time of humiliation did not always exercise and use it. So there's the distinction between the possession of the majesty and the exercising of the majesty, not just a visible veiling of the majesty like you have in Brenz. Chemnitz then gives a very full definition of Christ's self-renunciation. Quote, it does not signify a deprivation, removal, despoiling, putting off, casting aside, laying down, want, absence, defect, destitution, or vacancy of the fullness of the Godhead, which from the very moment of conception dwelt in Christ bodily. Well, he's got a long list of terms there, and that's helpful, because that's ultimately what we want to do, and that's very Chalcedonian, which is to say it's not this. He's trying to outline these are not the things that are going on, and this becomes then a very clear statement against what is later the kenotic view. I mean, there's no question that Chemnitz rejected that kenotic view. Now, what some of the 19th century guys are going to argue is that they just that the Lutheran Orthodox didn't, they didn't see the full implications of what they were doing. That the kenoticists kind of saw themselves as being, more Lutheran Orthodox than the Lutheran Orthodox. They were just recognizing the kind of necessary end results that they didn't happen to get to just yet on these points. But Chemnitz is very, very blatant against the idea that there was some kind of literal putting off of the divine nature. All right, so then we'll keep reading the Chemnitz quote here. He says, "But it respects its use or employment because being covered by weakness," so it's not that divinity is not there, but it's covered by weakness of the humanity, "during the time of self-renunciation, it did not always shine in and through the human nature of Christ." So it didn't always actually work in and through the humanity, and that's what we see here, different from Brenz. "And through it fully and clearly exercise itself. For a short time, withdrawing and withholding from activity the divine virtue present and dwelling bodily in the human nature, and through the human nature of Christ, he permitted his natural properties and other assumed infirmities to prevail, predominate, and exercise themselves alone in his human nature." So he's saying Christ is allowing in his human nature the natural infirmities of humanity to predominate in his life. And he does that in order to redeem us. And that's a necessary part of redemption. He assumes all of our infirmities and lives a life of fallen sinful creatures, even though he himself is not a sinner. But he takes upon the infirmities natural to sinful humanity in his life in order to save us and redeem us from those things. But he's very clear here that this is not a rejection of divinity, and he becomes even more clear here. "Lest anyone, because of the self-renunciation of this employment, should imagine the absence and defect of this very fullness of the divine nature and the humanity of Christ, he, in the very time of self-renunciation, whenever he wished, showed that the fullness dwelt in his flesh. And in the very time, far as his self-renunciation, whenever and as wished, he exercised, manifested, and employed its use by means of his assumed nature. Thus, in miracles, he manifested his glory." So what he's saying here is that every time we see Jesus performing a miracle, when we see Jesus even doing things like forgiving sins, when we see Jesus walking on water, demonstrating his power, say, over the demonic realm, demonic forces, these are all demonstrations of the deity of Christ. So kenoticism is to be rejected just by looking at the gospel narratives themselves, because it's very clear in the gospel narratives that the fullness of divinity and divine attributes is necessary to do the kinds of divine works that Jesus is doing throughout his ministry. So Chemnitz is very clear against the kenotic perspective. And so the kenoticists certainly can't claim Chemnitz. And it's interesting how much Chemnitz is anticipating this, because he's seeing that there would be a danger if someone were to take those perspectives. And it's not that there's a debate about this at the time, but he sees that there could be. So he's correcting what are possible misapprehensions right away from the very beginning. Okay. Chemnitz very clearly contrasts these following terms: incarnation, humiliation, and exaltation. So let's look at the threefold distinction that we see between them. In incarnation, there occurred a hypostatic or personal union of the Godhead of the Logos with the assumed humanity, in which the whole fullness of the Godhead dwelt personally from the first moment of conception. So what we don't see is what we find in Brenz, which is incarnation means this kind of invisible assumption of the humanity into its perfection and divine glory, and the creation of a kind of new person out of the two natures. But instead, the assumption of the humanity into the person that is the Logos. So second, we have the humiliation here. He says, by reason of self-renunciation, the employment or manifestation of the fullness of Godhead were for a time postponed. The fullness of manifestation and working of the Godhead, he's talking about through the humanity. And, as it were, suspended, so that it did not exercise itself through the assumed humanity immediately and always. All right. So it didn't. This is very clear. He's saying that it's the exercise of the divine attributes were not always worked through the humanity. So what we don't have is this necessity at the moment of incarnation that the humanity therefore had to have these divine attributes. It did not. And this is why when you read Chemnitz, you're going to constantly see this phrase that the divine attributes are given to the humanity or worked through the humanity as gift or as grace rather than nature. So it's not of the nature of the humanity that it now has these attributes, but it is a gift that they are granted to the humanity, which it very clearly, I think, differentiates him from the Brenz approach. By the ascension, infirmities being laid aside and self-renunciation removed, Christ left the mode of life according to the conditions of this world, and by his exaltation and sitting at the right hand of God, he entered upon the full and public employment and display of his power, virtue, and glory of the Godhead, which from the beginning of the union dwelt personally in its fullness in the assumed human nature, so that he no longer, as in self-renunciation, withholds, withdraws, and as it were hides himself, but clearly, manifestly, and gloriously exercises it in, with, and through the assumed human nature. All right, so clearly, we have these three different states. I mean, we've already kind of seen all of this, but Chemnitz outlines this. We have the state of, well, we have the pre-existent Christ, and we talk about the threefold glory that we talked about before, the glory of the divinity, the logos, asarkos, the logos without the flesh. Then the second kind of glory is the glory that is kind of hidden in the human life of Christ, but displayed at times. And then we have the third kind of glory, which is the glory where we have the humanity of Christ now exercising the fullness of divine glory as the complete manifestation of the divine attributes and glory and omnipotence and omnipresence, and all of these things are exercised in and through the humanity of Christ while retaining his essential humanity at the same time. So he's essentially defining what is that third form of glory. That kind of absolute glory is now the property not just of the divinity, but also shown through the humanity in its fullness. So here then we have the brief summary of the debate between Chemnitz and Brenz. He says, generally speaking, we can define the debate as this. With Brenz, the state of humiliation consists in possession, with habitual concealed use in majesty, with Chemnitz in possession, but with occasional use and prevailing non-use. So for Brenz, the majesty is always used, it's just concealed. Which, again, I think you just have a hard time reconciling with the biblical text. And this is why people haven't generally followed Brenz on this issue. According to Brenz, Christ in a state of humiliation not only could use, but did use, and could not help but using. So there's a necessity of this because of the union itself. His majesty as a communicated attribute of his human nature. Only in that state the use was concealed and hidden. And this is what how do you have a genuine learning or a human experience of Christ if he's always manifesting his majesty, just hiding it? Well, in a state of exaltation, it is open. So I think you have a really hard time with this. According to the Gospels, just the narrative of Jesus's life, which appears to be very human. And if there's the fullness of this majesty operating at all times, how do you have a real human life? I mean, that's the difficulty of Brenz's view. So according to Chemnitz, Christ in the state of humiliation could use his majesty in, through, and with his humanity, and sometimes did use it to show the fact of possession, but generally he did not wish to use it. In the state of exaltation, on the other hand, he entered into the full and manifest use and exhibition of his divine majesty in and by his assumed human nature. All right. So then we have mention of the formula of Concord here, and I don't think I want to read all of this because I'm doing a lot of reading on this one. But here's basically a summary of what he's trying to say here. That in the formula of Concord, the views of Brenz and Chemnitz they're already existent at this time. So people are familiar with this debate. People know about this debate. But for whatever reason, the Formula of Concord does not see it fit and necessary to address it. So it's not one of the major issues that is addressed in the Formula of Concord. Now, it was an inter-Lutheran debate among the second-generation reformers. So it certainly is, the kind of thing that could have been a point of debate and could have been settled here. But for whatever reason, they didn't deem it necessary to do that as a separate article in the Formula of Concord. But basically what Weiner is going to say is, what we do have in the Formula of Concord, there is an article on the two natures of Christ, where we deal with controversies with the Reformed. And in that language, I think it's pretty clear. I mean, if you read the Formula of Concord with this in mind, with these questions in mind, and read what it says about the two natures of Christ, it is, I think, very clear that it is Chemnitz's view that's presented. I mean, so even if it's not explicitly, a point of controversy, it's Chemnitz's view that's presented. So think about, this is similar to like what you find, say, with the Westminster Confession of Faith, when you have at the Westminster Assembly, so I'm now moving to the Reformed confessions, but this is confessions in general, people have to decide what issues are we going to make an issue of, and where are we going to kind of leave things and not give an answer explicitly, because you can't talk about everything, and you can't define literally every single doctrine on every point and how you exegete every text in a confession of faith. That would just be crazy, and it would, I think, bind people far too much, because if you ever come to a different exegetical conclusion about anything, it's like, well, you got to, I don't know, rewrite your confession of faith or something, or I guess you're bound to every exegetical conclusion that somebody had in the 16th century, which I think is going beyond the use of confession. So I think there's wisdom in confessions and trying to say what are issues that we want to make really clear, and what are issues that we're leaving open. And sometimes you get these issues in confessions of faith where you have, it's not explicitly mentioned as a point of debate, but it's pretty clear what approach the confession is taking, even if it's not an explicit article. So I mentioned the Westminster Confession because here there's another example of this, which is you have a debate between the supralapsarians and the infralapsarians. The supralapsarians being, and I'm not going to get into all the details here, and I've done that elsewhere, but the supralapsarian perspective being the more like really strict double predestinarian view, and the infralapsarian being the more moderate predestinarian view that God is not so active in predestination unto damnation, that it's a mere kind of passing over of the damned rather than an active deciding to make them fall into sin. I don't know if it's the right word to use there anyway, but regardless, the point is, in the Westminster Confession, at the Westminster Assembly, there were both positions represented. But if you read the words of the confession, it's pretty clear that it's the infralapsarian position that's presented there. Like, even if it's not explicit that there was an article on that, or it says it explicitly. So I think this is something similar that you find in the Formula of Concord is, so no, it is not clear, and that there's no separate article on it. But if you read the Formula of Concord, asking the questions of which view is represented here, it's pretty clearly Chemnitz. So I don't really know people who have taken Brenz's view much since. I mean, Chemnitz is pretty much the place where everybody goes, and I think it's pretty clear when you look at Brenz's view that there are some significant issues. Okay, so let's look then, and you can read the quotes from the formula there if you have the copy of this book, or you can honestly just find the Formula of Concord online if you want to read it. But then we have this second debate I can quickly kind of go through this. This is a discussion between theologians of Tübingen and Giessen. These are both very significant theological schools. Tübingen kind of becomes the hotbed of Protestant liberalism. That's what I think of when I think of Tübingen, but it wasn't at this time. So Widener's going to say the questions raised by Brenz and Chemnitz, there's no definitive decision, right? The Formula of Concord didn't make an explicit article on this issue. And this question is in some ways in 1607 brought up again among theologians at these two theological schools. And here is the question that is posed, that people are answering in different ways. Whether the man Christ, having been taken into union with God during the state of humiliation, governed as a king all things, though in secret. So you see how this is very, very related to this question of Brenz is, did he still rule and reign all things as a man in heaven, but doing it secretly, so that there are kind of two existences of the humanity of Christ? Because, in some sense, and we've talked about this before, you do have to say that there are kind of two, in some, not two literal separate existences, but there are two manners in which Christ lives somehow here, because he doesn't give up his reign of glory. So he has this heavenly life, but then also he has this life of humiliation at the same time. And unless you're a kenoticist, and the kenoticists are going to say that's too confusing, we need to get rid of that category altogether. But then you've got issues of Trinitarian theology, that what happens when one person of the Trinity is somehow not operating. And it also messes with things like atemporality and all sorts of other doctrines. But so that's the question here, which is not exactly the particulars dealing with Brenz, but very, very clearly related. So you've got theologians from these different schools. So Tübingen, people are affirming this. They are taking more of the Brenzian position, and Giessen deny this, taking more of the Chemnitz position. So the Tübingen theologians regarded the flesh of Christ as omnipresent absolutely to all creatures from the moment of his conception. Sounds like Brenz, right? The Giessen theologians distinguish between presentia intima, or the intimate, inseparable presence of the flesh to the Logos. And so we've got more distinctions. That's what we need in our Christology. We just need to keep making more and more and more and more distinctions. That's the history of Christology, isn't it? We just make so many distinctions till we totally lose track of them. But so why not throw another one in here? Okay, so we've got the presentia intima, the intimate, inseparable presence of the flesh to the Logos, and then we have parenthetical remark, and from this presence to the Logos follows the possibility of the humanity being present at the divine will to any part of creation. So this intimate presence then does not create an absolute necessity of the humanity being omnipresent or omnipotent, but it creates the possibility of it, the union through which that thing can now happen, without making it absolute at that time. And then there's the presentia extima, which is the absolute presence to all creatures, maintaining that without detriment to the personal union, they could assume that the divine nature of Christ was intimately and absolutely present to all creatures at all times, but not so the human nature in the state of humiliation, except at the divine will. And this is what I think is the right view, but just so this is just to say that it is the divine will working through the humanity that determines that he can work all powerfully through the humanity if he so desires, but that's not a necessity in the state of humiliation. And just when you get Brenz's view, right? If Brenz's view is the view that's, say, if that were the standard view, you could see why the canonic position would be attractive, because it's at least the canonic position takes the humiliation seriously. And what Brenz's perspective does, it gives you a kind of phantom humiliation. It's just an appearance of a humiliation, but it's not anything real. So the question is, do we need then to reject that and fall to the kenoticist side? Whereas I think what you find in the Giessen theologians following Chemnitz is a much more clear, moderated view where you can say, no, he's not exercising these through his humanity, but that doesn't mean he doesn't possess them. So it's not that the divinity gives up these attributes or the humanity doesn't possess them in some way, but they're not exercised. Because I think you can get, in that perspective, a real union. You don't mess with immutability, but you can also have a real humiliation in a way that the Tübingen thinkers here following Brenz really don't allow for, I think, in its fullness. And I will say you do find this in some of the fathers too. And I mentioned this before about, Clement of Alexandria, and Cyril of Alexandria is the same way. And I love Cyril of Alexandria, but and I know people tend not to like Cyril because he's supposedly kind of a jerk, but I love his Christological writings. But those theologians, and I think it's because of their some ideas from their Platonism that, and I don't always see the influence of Platonism as a bad thing, because I myself consider myself something of a Neoplatonist on many issues, though certainly a Christian first. so it depends on what issue, but. When we are, looking at some of those Middle and Neoplatonist influenced thinkers, there is such a kind of fear of even an emotionality and part of the, maybe that's really more influence of Stoicism, honestly, but an emotionality on part of Christ's humanity, so that, say the emotions of Christ that are displayed are really more external than they are internal. They're just kind of for the sake of others to see them rather than anything actually going on internally. So I think Brenz kind of has a similar issue here that you find in some of those thinkers. So I don't think these guys are coming at it from nowhere, but you've got to have a real humiliation. This is something that people have, of course, we're going to wrestle with. How is it that God becomes man, and what does it mean that as God becomes man, he has a real human experience? And what parts of the human experience does he not experience? He certainly doesn't experience sin, at least in the sense of committing his own personal sin, contra Paulson. Okay, but let's then move on here to explaining a little bit more of what's going on. So he said the Tübingen theologians, Osiander, Nikolai, Hoffenreffer, Dumius, I don't even know who that is, that last one actually. Don't know much about him. Taught that Christ in his humiliation governed heaven and earth in the same way he exercises government in the state of exaltation. So Nikolai, Hoffenreffer are very, very significant thinkers. So these aren't no slouches here. In the same way that exercised in the state of exaltation with only this difference. So here's the only difference between his ruling in the state of humiliation versus exaltation. That in the state of humiliation, he covered and concealed that government under the form of a servant. But now, having laid aside that servile condition, he declares and manifests the same gloriously and majestically. Yeah, and again, you really have the same difficulties of the text that seem to speak of something real changing according to the human nature of Christ in terms of his presence of authority and power in life through the exaltation. I don't know how you come to these conclusions based on the text. I really do think it's just a kind of trying to put one on the Reformed that leads to this. The Giessen theologians, Menzer, Wenkelmann, Feuerborn, who adopt the views of Chemnitz, held that according to this view of the Tübingen school, there was no kenosis or renunciation of the proper sense of the world, but merely a crypsis or a concealment. For according to this view, the divine dominion was exercised during the state of humiliation by the human nature only in a secret manner. And essentially, we can kind of summarize this. Basically, they're just taking the same view that we already talked about in Chemnitz, so I don't think I need to read the rest of it. But it's the same criticism that I have. You've got to have a real humiliation, and you really can't have that in Brenz's perspective. And Scripture, I think, presents far more than just a concealment of these things, that there is a real humiliation going on. So it says both parties agreed on some things, like the possession of the divine attributes by Christ during all the stages of humiliation, differed only as to the use of them. Okay, so the use of them being is it that they're used but concealed, or not used until the exaltation. Then we have the decision of the Saxon theologians in 1624. The Decisio Saxonica, 1624, in the main was favorable to the Giessen theologians, and without entering more deeply into the consideration of the question, especially emphasized the fact that though in his state of humiliation, Christ did not use his divine dominion, yet by way of exception, Christ during his life on earth did make use, on the part of his human nature, of the right of divine majesty that belonged to him, as in the performance of miracles. Succeeding theologians adopted the views of the Giessen and Saxon theologians. It is only in recent times that the controversy has been renewed in a modified form on a new basis. So then he says, he cites those who take the kenotic position here. And again, look at our talk on the kenotic view. But he cites these figures as those who are proponents of the kenotic perspective that go much farther than Giessen does. So you have Thomasius, Leibner, Gess, von Hoffmann, Kahnis, Delitzsch, Schoberlein, and Kubel. And then we also have some of the Reformed that are mentioned here, Lang, Ebrard, Gaudet, and Presence. So they've taken it much farther than that. And it says this: they would substitute a genus canonicum for the genus majestaticum of the Lutheran confessions. In other words, a communication of the properties of humanity to divinity. Don't want to do that. For the communication of the properties of the divine nature to the human. Sorry, that's the one you don't want to do. You do want to do the first one. Sorry, confusing myself here. Okay, Dorner calls this a revival of Apollinarianism and Patripassianism, and it resembles both in some features, but it differs from them by assuming a truly humanized logos dwelling in a human body. Dorner, being Isaac August Dorner, who is a critic of the kenoticists, but agrees with the kenoticists on their rejection of divine immutability. Dorner is kind of, in some ways, a moderating theologian. He is a critic of a lot of classical theology, but is also a major critic of Protestant liberalism in many ways as well. Maybe kind of like an early Barth type figure. Interesting thinker, but I think very wrong on his critiques of Gerhard and the other classical theologies. All right, so there you go. You get there is the end of this kind of debate among Lutheran theologians. So we kind of walk you through what are different views of the communication of attributes. So this is one of those things that has continued to be debated among Lutherans, and you do have, I think, the Giessen approach, I think, really is, and the Chemnitz approach, I just think it's so much more right. And I think that the Brenz approach really does lead to a lot of the caricatures that the Reformed have. But the Chemnitz approach, I'll say, that's pretty standard among Lutherans. I think that ultimately is really what's reflected in our confessions, and it is mostly what is standard, but you do find some significant figures that take the other approach. I don't know about today, at least today in Christological talks that I've listened to at professors at seminaries. I think pretty much among confessional Lutherans, as far as I can see, the Chemnitz view pretty much is the view that has won the day at this point. If there is someone who's arguing otherwise, I would certainly be interested in looking at it, but I don't really know anyone today, as far as I can think of, that would majorly defend Brenz's view. I think probably the kenotic controversy had led people to recognizing we need a moderating position, because some of the kenotic critiques of at least Brenz's view were kind of right, but then they go wild with it and come to all sorts of weird conclusions. And I think if we hold the Giessen view, we can both affirm a reality of the humiliation, but also not go the direction of denying of affirming some kind of real rejection of divine attributes on the part of the divinity of Christ during the humiliation. All right, so thank you so much for listening and or watching this. And next time we're going to delve then into the state of humiliation as it was discussed among the Lutheran dogmaticians. And so we're going to look at some of the 17th century thinkers and how they explored the humiliation and exaltation of Christ. And once we get through that, we are then going to start to get into developments in Christology. So we can look at some modern theologies. That's where we're going to, at least in the playlist, put that video I already did on kenoticism in order. And then we'll look at some other modern theologians and Christological developments. And I want to go through some today as well, in the past 100 years since Widener wrote. All right. Thank you so much. See you in the next one. God bless.